Today we're out here in the forest taking a look at an SUV that is nearly as old as the trees themselves, the Lexus GX 460. The basics of the GX date back to 2002, this generation dates back to 2009. It got the spindle grille, which is the shape that we find up here, in 2013, and then for 2020 it got some very minor tweaks. But really, when you take a look at the GX 460 and you drive it out on the road, it's as if this SUV was set in amber. Everything about the GX 460 really harkens from a different era, even though Lexus has tried to update things from time to time. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the GX 460 sells really quite well. GX 460 sales were pretty good in 2019. They moved over 25,000 units, which is not too bad for a luxury SUV that is well over $60,000 for most of the models you'll see on the dealer lots. For the record, that's about half the sales of the BMW X5. And remember that this is not necessarily the most direct competitor to the X5 in the Lexus lineup, because Lexus also sells the RX, and the RX and the GX combined certainly outsell the BMW. This may sound odd to some people, but the very age of the GX 460 is really the key to its continued sales success. If you're looking for a rugged, reliable, dependable, off-road capable, body-on-frame SUV in the luxury segment, you have very few options, two of them in the Lexus envelope. This GX right here, the larger Lexus LX, and then something like a Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon. For the 2020 model year, Lexus has given this a very minor styling tweak, so we get new LED headlamps up front. These mimic what we see in a lot of Lexus's most recent models. We have the Nike Swoosh LED daytime running lamp there, some little squiggles inside, 3 LED modules, and then we get a more expressive version of the Lexus spindle grille. Even though the GX wasn't designed for this grille to begin with, I think that they've done a good job integrating it with the rest of the GX. But the bulk of this SUV does remain the same for 2020, and that means that we are missing a number of modern features that you will find in other Lexus models like the RX. We don't have a huge infotainment screen, we don't have Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, and some of the luxury features that we do find in other Lexus models are missing on this model. But in trade for that, we have legendary Land Cruiser off-road DNA under the skin. You see, the close relative to the GX 460 is not the Toyota 4Runner, as some people might say in America. It's actually the Land Cruiser Prado, which is not sold in the US but is sold around the world and certainly has a solid off-road reputation. That relationship is immediately obvious when you park this against some of the other luxury competitors. This is an awful lot narrower, and that lends itself towards better off-roading. This is 4 to 6 inches narrower than many of its direct European competitors, and that's really obvious when you take a look at this head-on as you're doing right now. It certainly looks a little bit narrow and certainly a little bit tall. At 192.1 inches long, this is almost exactly the same length as the Lexus RX and, interestingly enough, the Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon. This is a notable few inches shorter than the Mercedes-Benz GLE and the BMW X5. When you take a look at some of the spec sheets, you'll notice that since 2009, the GX has grown a little bit, and that's entirely due to the bumpers and that spindle grille design up front. But the bones of the GX 460 have really not changed since about 2009, and those bones are important to understand the mission of the GX 460, because this is one of the few body-on-frame SUVs you can buy in America, and one of the very few luxury body-on-frame SUVs that are smaller than something like a Cadillac Escalade. Outside the Escalade, as I mentioned before, you really don't have too many options. We have the Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon, the Lexus LX, and this Lexus GX right here. So what is a body-on-frame SUV, and how does it differ from the average luxury crossover, say a BMW X5? Well, as the name implies, we have a body, which is where you're sitting, where you put the cargo, the sheet metal we're taking a look at right here, and it is sitting on top of a frame. And the frame is what holds the tires in place, the wheels, the suspension, the engine, the transmission, etc. The key thing to know about body-on-frame SUVs is that the body is not firmly connected to the frame. There is a little bit of play allowed between the frame and the body itself, so there's a little bit of isolation going on there. A BMW X5 or a Mercedes-Benz GLE, on the other hand, are unibody crossovers, and that means that we don't have a separate frame component. The mounting points for the suspension, the engine, the transmission, etc. are all part of the body itself. That's why we call it a unibody. There are pros and cons to each design. Unibody vehicles generally tend to be a little bit lighter, a little bit more fun to drive, while body-on-frame vehicles like this tend to be designed for slightly more rugged conditions, and they have more isolation when you're towing a trailer. So if you have a trailer connected to the hitch, as that hitch is rattling around on the frame of the vehicle, you're not hearing as much in the body of the vehicle. But clearly these are generalizations, because it's obvious that you can make unibody SUVs that are very capable off-road, for instance the Jeep Grand Cherokee, the Land Rover lineup, etc. Out back we find combination tail lamp modules, which means that the brake lights and the parking lights are LEDs, but the turn signals are incandescent. It's a little bit unusual in the luxury segment right now. Also unusual is the fact that we don't have a liftgate. We have a side swinging hatch, something that we just don't find in SUVs anymore. And another feature that we don't find very often now is a separately opening glass. Personally, I think this is a bit of a mixed bag. I love the fact that the glass opens separately, but I do find the side swinging hatch to be less convenient than a traditional liftgate. On the other hand, someone reminded me this week that it may be preferred if you're a taller person, because if you swing this gate open, assuming you have room and you don't parallel park very frequently, then you don't have a hatch to bop you in the head if you're a taller person. The last benefit is clearly less of a consideration for most American luxury vehicle shoppers, and that's the fact that with a side-swinging hatch like this, you could put an aftermarket accessory on that would allow you to put a second spare tire on the GX460, one that's mounted back here, and still be able to get into the cargo compartment. That's an awful lot harder if you have a liftgate. As we see with the rest of the Lexus lineup, this is very well equipped when it comes to active safety. We find a whole host of active safety technologies standard on this that are optional on the European competition. And we have a ton of things available that are somewhat safety related and somewhat off-road related as well, like the available 360-degree camera system that this model has. The GX is one of the few luxury vehicles left in America where the number on the back actually means engine displacement, not some random number pulled out of thin air or some strange mathematical formula. But things under here are certainly old school. We have a 4.6-liter naturally aspirated V8 engine, a 6-speed automatic transmission. This engine produces 301 horsepower and 329 pound-feet of torque, and we even have an engine-driven fan. In the US, four-wheel drive is standard, and that four-wheel drive system is a little bit different than the four-wheel drive system that we find in most of the competition. This has a true torsion center differential. So this is not simply a clutch pack that can open or close to send power to the front or the rear. This is always driving both axles, with generally speaking a 60% power split to the rear, about 40% to the front, but the system can divide power as it's needed. We also have a 2-speed transfer case. On the downside, there is a cost for the four-wheel drive capability, and that is fuel economy. This averages 16 miles per gallon according to the EPA. Towing ability is one of the reasons that you might want to get the GX460 over the average luxury crossover. When properly equipped, this will tow 6,500 pounds. That's a little bit below the BMW X5's rating of 6,600 pounds or the LX at 7,000 pounds, but it is significantly above the Lexus RX, which tops out at about 3,500 pounds. For some shoppers, the way the GX tows is going to be a little bit more important than the towing number itself, because as a body-on-frame SUV, this is going to have a bit more isolation between the trailer and the receiver and the interior of the vehicle, as I said before, but we also have a solid rear axle and a load-leveling rear air suspension. All those things together make the GX460 feel very confident out on the road when towing, and that's why the last time I was shopping for an SUV, the GX460 was honestly at the top of my shopping list right next to the Dodge Durango, which I ended up getting simply because it was less expensive than the GX460. But this does an excellent job at towing 6,000 to 6,500 pounds, or even really a little bit more if you wanted to do it. At the bottom of the bumper, we have a frame-mounted hitch receiver. We also have 4-pin and 7-pin wiring harness connections. Now's a good time to talk about the suspension setup in the GX460 because it is fairly unique. As I said, we have a rear load-leveling air suspension, but this is not a 4-corner adaptive height suspension like we find in the LX570. And although the system does have an off-road benefit, it does not improve ground clearance when it's set to its maximum height. And that's because ground clearance is defined by the distance between the rear axle and the ground. That really is the limiting factor. And simply raising the body above that axle does not really improve your ground clearance. But it is going to improve the overall angles and the off-road ability. And that's why we do have that adjustable height setting, in addition to load leveling for putting passengers in the rear, heavier cargo, or of course tongue weight. In addition to that, we have a 4-corner adaptive damping system. So in the rear, we have airbags that are supporting the weight of the vehicle, and then the dampers are active in the rear and up front. Then on top of that, we have a passive hydraulic system that Lexus calls KDSS, or Kinetic Dynamic Suspension System. KDSS gives you a lot of the benefit of an electronically disconnecting sway bar setup like we find in modern Jeeps, without some of that electrical complexity, because this is a completely passive system. Basically what's going on is we have 2 hydraulic rams, one on the front anti-roll bar and one on the rear anti-roll bar. They're connected via some accumulators and a lot of tubing. In a nutshell, when you're out on a winding mountain road or you're turning left or right, the forces on the anti-roll bars are more or less consistent because the vehicle is trying to lean in one direction or another. In this situation, the anti-roll bars stay in place. They stay pretty firm to keep the vehicle really planted, really level, and you'll certainly notice that in the GX460. Even though handling ability is certainly not where we find something like a BMW X5, this stays very level and very planted in the corners. But if you take the GX 460 a little bit further off the beaten path and you're in a situation where the vehicle needs to adjust to off-camber setup, say you need the front left wheel to be up in the air and meanwhile you need the right rear wheel to be down on the ground, then the system comes into play. And because of the imbalance on forces on the front anti-roll bar and the rear anti-roll bar, KDSS allows a lot more motion in the suspension system. And that gives you the wheel articulation that you need off-road, but also keeps the vehicle nice and planted on-road. The reason we don't see this system in too many vehicles out there is quite simply because it's expensive. Although we do find variants of this in other vehicles out there. For instance, it's available in the Toyota 4Runner. When it comes to front seat comfort, I'm going to give these seats 7 out of 10 points. These are not as adjustable as we find in the competition. So we just have a 2-way adjustable lumbar support, for instance, not a 4-way lumbar, no inflatable side cushions, no extending thigh cushion either. But we do have a memory-linked powered tilt telescopic steering column with a 2-position memory over there on the door. And the passenger seat has the same range of motion as the driver's seat. The GX is available with either captain's chairs in the second row or a bench seat. I think that I would get the bench seat because that would allow you to seat 5 more comfortably than the model that we're driving right here. We'll take a look at the third row in a bit, but they really are emergency third row seats. And the second row is pretty roomy. I have a lot of headroom with a very upright, boxy profile in this vehicle. Even though we have the sunroof right here, I still have about 3 inches of headroom left, and you can see that I have a generous amount of legroom as well. Now, thankfully, Lexus does let you slide the second row seats forward and backward to help you apportion the legroom a little bit more equitably between the front, second, and third row, but keep in mind that at 105.1 inches of combined legroom, this is smaller inside than something like a Toyota Highlander. An oddity likely due to the age of the GX 460 are the locations of the cup holders for the second row. You can see that they're right here between the 2 captain's chairs. That makes it a lot more likely that someone's going to accidentally step on those if they're getting in and out of the third row, although it does look like they would fold into place if you don't step on it too quickly. It's important to remember that the GX is not a terribly long vehicle, so even in that tilt slide configuration, the opening to the third row is pretty narrow. Now, hopping back here, we definitely find one of the more compact third rows, but this is still a lot more usable than the Lexus RXL. Electric third row seats are adjustable from back here in the third row passenger area. If I try and put it all the way back, you'll notice I can't really put my head back there to the headrest, but if I put it in this very upright position, then I have a little bit more room, but again, certainly more than we find in the Lexus RXL. If I move this second row seat back to a position that I found comfortable in the second row, you see I have about an inch of legroom left. For some reason, third row passengers have to share just one cup holder. It's over on my side. This is about 2 inches deep. There is what looks like a cup holder on the other side, but it's really only about 1/3 of an inch deep. As you'd expect in a third row that's primarily designed for cargo, the plastics back here are pretty hard, but we do have 2 well-positioned air vents right here in the ceiling for third row passengers, and from here you can see that the second row passengers get height-adjustable shoulder belts. The third row seats are power folding, and you can put them in a little bit more of an upright position if you want a little bit of additional room. It will lock in a slightly more upright position, but I think that most people are going to leave it in this completely down position. According to the specifications behind the fifth door, we find 11.2 cubic feet of storage space. But honestly, this seems a little bit smaller to me because I couldn't even put a 22-inch roller bag behind the third row seats. This really should be thought of as a 5-seat or 4-seat vehicle with 2 emergency seats in the back. Now, once these seats are folded, we do find 46.7 cubic feet of storage space, which is a pretty generous cargo area, and it is pretty broad and pretty square as well. But in terms of cargo practicality, there are certainly better options out there. Some of this is due to the age of the GX 460, and some of it is due to its body-on-frame design. You'll notice that the cargo area load floor is actually quite a bit higher than the opening itself. Some of that is due to the way that the frame and the cargo area interact with one another and the fact that we have a full-size spare tire right under the vehicle in this area. On the door strut that holds the door open, you'll notice we have a lock and unlock icon. This allows you to rotate this section and lock the door in an open position if you're parking on a hill. On the door, there's some additional storage areas. Behind door number 1, we find the tow hook and the tire iron. And then behind door number 2, we have some storage space that's available for you. This is where you'd find the emergency triangle in some world markets. Hopping inside, we have a pretty standard-sized moonroof right here over the driver and front passengers' heads. The driver and front passenger get height-adjustable shoulder belts and 2-way adjustable headrests. The model that we're driving has the optional rear seat entertainment system right there behind the headrests. The leather upholstery in here is perforated because the seats are both heated and ventilated up front. If we move over to the front door panels, we have a large portion of soft touch materials going on and some glossy wood trim right there as we find in classic Lexus models. As you'd expect from a vehicle that has a bit of an off-road mission, we do have hard plastics down there at the bottom of the door to help keep them from getting scuffed up too much. Moving over to the dashboard, we have a soft touch injection molded upper section, a stitched lower section right there. real wood trim between them, and then we have a slot-style glove compartment. This is not quite big enough to fit one of those larger tablet computers inside. Moving over to the center of the dashboard, we have two large air vents, one of the older infotainment systems in the Lexus lineup. This vehicle never got the Lexus joystick or the Lexus touchpad controller. Instead, this has remained a touchscreen infotainment system this entire time. And because of its age, it does not support Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, but it does have a traditional iPhone USB interface. We also have XM satellite radio and some limited app integration there as well. This is the previous generation, really, of Lexus's software. Below the infotainment system, we find the controls for the tri-zone automatic climate control, the two front zones, and then there's a rear button to sync that in with everything. There's a button for the transmission to start off in second gear, and then below that we have a center differential lock. This does have a true center differential rather than simply a multi-plate clutch contraption, so we do need that lock button right there if you want to split power evenly 50-50. Otherwise, torsion differentials will tend to slip if one axle has absolutely no traction. Below the physical infotainment buttons, we have roller controls for the heated and ventilated seats. There's also a CD player there if you're interested in one. Behind this sliding little door, we find the USB inputs for the infotainment system, a very small storage cubby. You wouldn't be able to put any of those larger smartphones in there. And then behind that, we find a gated shifter. You can see we have drive back here, sport mode over to the left with a manual shift mode. To the right of the shifter, we have a bank of toggle shifters. This one controls the adaptive rear axle height. So we can choose between low, high, and then a neutral setting. This allows you to toggle through those different settings. We then have an off button that prevents the vehicle from adapting that height. So if you want to stay in a fixed position, for instance, changing a tire, you want to hit that off button right there. Over on this side, we have the adaptive damper control, comfort, normal, and then a sport mode up top. Then we have a toggle for the 2-speed transfer case. 4 high is the default. We can also push that down and get a 4 low mode. The car will then beep at us and tell us that we need to shift over to neutral so that way we can actually change. When we're in 4 low, the 360-degree camera system automatically pops up on the infotainment system. It also gives us a little bit of an inclination icon right there. And it also enables the crawl control and multi-terrain select system. This allows us to toggle between rock, rock and dirt, mogul, loose rock, and mud and sand. There aren't icons on the side, but there is an info screen that pops up between the speedometer and tachometer to let you know the mode that you're in. I can choose crawl control with this button right here, and then this becomes a crawl control rather than just the multi-terrain system. Both crawl control and the multi-terrain system are only available in 4 low. Behind that, we have 2 large cup holders. And then we have a split center armrest, so we have right and left right there, and then this opens in a more traditional fashion to give us access to a pretty deep storage compartment. For a size reference, I was just barely able to get a gallon of milk inside. The instrument cluster features a fairly basic design. We have physical gauges for just about everything, and then in the center we have a color multifunction display, but this is one of the smaller ones in the Lexus lineup. This gives us things like the status of the active safety features, the ability to change certain vehicle settings, primarily having to do with the autonomous safety systems. We also get our trip computer readout right there. The steering wheel is also a little bit old school in the Lexus lineup. We still have a cruise control stalk right down there rather than the cruise control buttons on the front of the steering wheel like we find in their newest models. This is an adaptive cruise control system, so there's a distance button right there. We also have lane keeping assistance via that button. This button module on the right side controls that multifunction display. Then we have infotainment controls over here on the left. No paddle shifters on the back. But we do have aggressive sport grips and a lot of wood trim going on, wood on the bottom, and then a larger wood section on the top. Let's talk about some of the numbers here first. 0 to 60 happened in this model in 7.3 seconds. That is a little bit better than Lexus's quoted time, but certainly behind a lot of the more powerful V8s that we find in the competition. Remember, this engine produces 301 horsepower, so this is about the same amount of power that we find in the base engine in the BMW X5. Likely because of the more off-road mission in the GX, our braking distances are also a little bit longer than normal, 134 feet for this particular model. We have more on-road focused wheels and tires in this vehicle, but they're not on-road focused, I guess you'd say. They're not as on-road focused as the wheel and tire combinations that we find in the GLE and in the X5 in mainline configurations. That combined with the overall design of the GX, the braking design, etc., just yields longer stopping distances than you'd find in the average luxury crossover. It's one of the hottest days of the year here, so I'm really glad that we have the ventilated seats in this particular model. It is over 100 degrees outside, 103 today, and I'm melting. Fortunately, the air conditioning in here is also quite old school, meaning I have Arctic Blast coming out right now at me. If you're worried about that, the GX460 has an excellent AC. The first few things you'll notice about the GX when you get this out on pavement are the 6-speed automatic transmission. This definitely feels a few gears behind the competition. The reason we have more modern 8, 9, and 10-speed automatic transmissions is that we can have a combination of a much lower starting gear to give you better acceleration, also better pull when towing a trailer, and we have higher final gears to give you better fuel economy when you're out on the open highway. And fuel economy is certainly an area where the GX falls behind the competition. The other thing you'll notice is how the GX handles corners. This definitely feels like an old school traditional SUV. There's really no steering feedback coming from the front. The solid axle in the rear can get upset over broken pavement in the corners. This is just not going to be as dynamic as something like the Lexus RX, even though the RX is a front-wheel drive crossover. That's why I'm going to give handling a C. This definitely feels like a scaled-down version of the Lexus LX. The LX is, of course, the Toyota Land Cruiser in Lexus form. On the other hand, we do have an excellent highway ride, so if you're looking for a soft highway cruiser, this is definitely going to be a good option. And of course, the mission of the GX was not to corner carve, it was to give us an off-road capable luxury SUV, as I really noticed on my way to get to the paved road that we're driving on now. Let's take a look at that. When it comes to the ride quality, the GX 460 does pretty well. Remember, we do have the adaptive damper system here, and we have the air suspension in the rear that really helps smooth out some of the larger imperfections out on a rougher road like the one that we're on here. I'm going to give this GX 460 an A- when it comes to ride quality because we do have somewhat low profile tires. So clearly, if you wanted to take your GX 460 more true rugged off-roading, you'd want to swap these guys out for higher profile tires that had a little bit more cushion, and that would also impact the ride. The reality, of course, is that we can't leave. Oh. Well, that's a bummer. Hang on. Let's see if I can move the tree out of the road. There's no way to pull this. So, yep, I'm going to need to come back with a chainsaw on this one. Now, theoretically, this is exactly the kind of luxury crossover that you'd want if you lived a little bit further off the beaten path like I do, because if you really didn't care about the front end and scratching it up, I could have just run right through that tree like I would with my Jeep Grand Cherokee, because I really don't care about the body on that vehicle at all. And this has all the off-road ability to do that. Unfortunately, I don't own this Lexus. Lexus does, so I'm not going to do that, and I'm not going to scratch the paint in the GX 460. But what I am going to do is run and grab one of my handy-dandy electric chainsaws, because they're very handy for situations like this, and just cut it enough to get through. A little bit of excitement in our video today. Just a little snip here and there, and we should be on our way. And of course, it's one of the hottest days of the year out here. It's over 100 degrees. Well, with that adventure taken care of, let's get back out on the road. Back out here on the paved road, the cabin isn't quite as isolated as you might think. I got 72 decibels in this cabin, meaning that it is going to be a little louder out here on a rougher road surface than something like the BMW X5. That surprised me a little bit because it's mainly tire noise that the GX has a problem with. Wind noise is very well controlled in here, but tire noise definitely makes its way into the cabin. Over a week of mixed driving, our fuel economy has been pretty much exactly what the EPA says it should be, with averaging 15.7 mpg. This model is rated for 16. Remember that we have a full-time four-wheel drive system with a true torsion center differential, so this is never going to be able to disconnect the front axle in order to improve highway fuel economy. It's always going to be sending about 40% of the power to the front, 60% of the power to the rear in steady straight line driving. But of course, as I said before, for off-roading, you can change that around. You can lock the center differential. This has a full lock of that center differential. You can of course engage the multi-terrain system, which is going to use the electronics to shuttle power left and right wherever it's needed. But we don't have a locking rear differential in this model or a locking front differential. On the other hand, we do have a 2-speed transfer case, which is something that we don't really find in many luxury entries out there outside the Land Rover and Range Rover lineups. Bottom lining the GX out on the road is pretty simple. This certainly feels like an old school SUV. I've driven a lot of body-on-frame SUVs. I've driven a lot of body-on-frame SUVs from the late 90s and early 2000s, and this definitely feels like a lot of them. This reminds me a great deal of the Buick and Saab versions, for instance, of the GMT 360 platform. It has a relatively soft ride, it has a soft rear axle in the back, it's definitely targeted at someone that wants a little bit more off-road ability, a little bit more towing ability than the average crossover out there, and honestly something for that shopper that's looking for something that drives and feels a bit more like a truck, logically a luxury truck, but still a truck nonetheless, rather than the average crossover which drives more like a passenger car. Some folks out there dismiss the GX as being a dinosaur, a vehicle from a different era, a time capsule, something that's been lost in time. But I think that there is still a market for customers that are after this kind of driving experience, this kind of towing experience, or of course the off-road ability, reliability, and dependability that's inherent in this kind of a design. Because we have an engine that's been around for quite some time in the Lexus lineup, a tried and true 6-speed automatic transmission and a very robust four-wheel drive system, this is the kind of vehicle that's going to operate just like it is for 100,000, 200,000 miles. And some people are certainly interested in that, and that's why the GX 460 still sells pretty well. Even though grip is clearly below the crossover-based competition, one thing that's interesting about the GX 460 and a little bit confidence-inspiring is again that we get very, very little body roll, and that's thanks to the KDSS suspension system. It's really amazing how something that feels big and feels heavy and feels like it should be wallowing around the road absolutely isn't. The pricing you see on your screen is for 2021. It's a little bit more expensive than 2020, but I decided to go with this pricing because we already know what the 2021 model year will bring us, and that is basically a very slight bump in MSRP, but no substantive changes. The base model GX 460 will start at $53,100. That's decently below a BMW X5 or a Mercedes-Benz GLE or an Audi Q7. And remember, we do get the standard four-wheel drive system with the 2-speed transfer case and a 6,500 pound tow rating. The next step up from there is the premium trim. This is the mid-grade version of the GX 460. That'll set you back $55,890. We then get the top-end version that we were driving today that started at $64,365, and with all of the options, it ends up just over $70,000. Now, on top of that, there are a number of dealer-installed options that you can get, but strictly from the factory, just about $70,000 is as high as you can take your GX 460. It's notably below entries like the BMW X5 or the Mercedes-Benz GLE. But that's quite logical because the GX really isn't the same thing as an X5 or a GLE or a Q7, and that's exactly why the GX 460 sales have been so constant. I'm going to forgo the usual comparison section here because I just don't think it applies to the GX 460. Either you're interested in a vehicle like this, that's a body-on-frame, traditional SUV that really focuses on rugged dependability, reliability, off-road ability, etc., or you're interested in something that's more of a corner carver. And survey says that there are certainly a decent number of people that are interested in an old school, more traditional SUV. I have to admit that the only thing that I really would want to change in the GX 460 is more comfortable front seats and a newer infotainment system. I think that there's definitely a place for the rest of the GX 460 in the automotive world. It has a naturally aspirated V8 engine, so if you're looking for something that's going to be bulletproof in terms of reliability, especially long-term reliability, the V8 in the GX is going to be an excellent option. It also has a very reliable 6-speed automatic transmission, although I really would like to see one of Lexus's newer 8-speeds in there. But that said, this is one of the very few off-road focused vehicles in the luxury segment left. It's one of the few that'll give you a 2-speed transfer case, a true torsion center differential, and a real frame under the body. If those are things that interest you and you don't want to spend as much as a Lexus LX, also known as the luxury Land Cruiser, or a Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon, you don't really have too many options outside the GX. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. I have to admit that if I were shopping in this segment, I would probably be looking at something like a crossover along the lines of a BMW X5. The tow rating is substantially similar to the GX 460, but it's going to tow very differently. It's also going to be more on-road focused, less off-road focused. I don't really need the off-road ability in a luxury SUV. I'd be more interested in the towing ability and the on-road performance, but let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. Unquestionably, the GX 460 is probably going to be less expensive to keep around than a BMW X5 in terms of maintenance and repair costs. Now, on the downside, fuel economy isn't exactly great in the GX, and that is an area that would be better in some of the luxury alternatives. But again, let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and let me know what you would like to see changed in upcoming versions of the GX. We don't know exactly what the future holds for this particular model, but Lexus seems pretty dedicated to giving us two different body-on-frame SUVs in America. I'll see all of you later.